by introducing yourself and your early background?
Well, I'm Alf Ekstrom. My parents came to Australia in 1950 when I was a small boy. I got all of my education in Australia. I think I started work at 18 as a technician with the then Australian Atomic Energy Commission, and did most of my university courses at night. I got a scholarship to complete a PhD degree. I can't even remember what year that was now. 60, must have been about 64 or so. I finished a PhD degree in 67, 68, and then went to the University of Wisconsin for 3 years. Spent the first year as a research associate and the following 2 years teaching in the chemistry department. I then had enough of the cold weather here and went back to Sydney. I was working then with the Atomic Energy Commission, largely on uranium-related chemistry. We did some work on uranium hexafluoride production, and particularly on laser photochemistry separation of uranium isotopes. That work finished in 1980, and I transferred to the then CSIRO Division of Energy Chemistry, where most of our work was production of liquid fuels from oil, shale, coal and natural gas. And it's really from that time on that I developed a slight interest in catalysis. I guess my main interest is really in reaction mechanisms, and it doesn't really matter too much whether they occur on surfaces or in the gas phase or in the liquid phase. For the last 5 or 6 years, gas conversion catalysis has really been my major preoccupation, and we now have projects on Fischer-Tropsch catalysis, natural gas conversion to ethylene, and most recently natural gas to syngas production.
How did you get interested in the isotope studies?
Oh, I think that really came out of my interest in mechanisms of reactions. Because of my involvement in nuclear chemistry and radiation chemistry, the use of radio isotopes to elucidate reaction mechanisms has always been at the back of my head, if you like. I think that particular reaction, which involves reacting methane with oxygen at very high temperatures over oxide catalysts, was really a very difficult one to study, because most of the conventional techniques like infrared spectroscopy and so on are simply impossible at the high temperatures which are required for the reaction, and isotope tracers was really the only technique which was available to look at the working catalyst.
Did you learn this on the job, or?
Yes.
What were the frustrations in starting out in this?
Well, there weren't any frustrations. The technique is really very simple. You just flow the two reactants over the catalyst, and once in a while you switch from one isotope to the other. We had all of the facilities available to us to do that. It was quite a straightforward experimental program, really.
Do you remember who it was who involved you first in catalysis?
No, it really followed when the government decided it was going to reduce atomic energy in Australia and wanted more effort on liquid fuels, and I guess it was probably some bureaucrat in Canberra that decided that we should be working in this area.
And how did you find switching to catalysis from separation?
I've never had any problems in my career so far. I think I've worked on 8 major areas of research, which have all been very different. And I think, generally speaking, after I've been working in one area for more than 3 or 4 years, I get bored and I'd like to do something different.
What were your first impressions as you started researching catalysis?
Mostly black magic. I guess I have a fairly cynical view of much of the scientific literature in catalysis. Not so much the experimental results, which are probably well done and quite unequivocal, but a lot of the interpretation of how molecules react on surfaces, on real live catalysts, I think is mostly wishful thinking.
Who in catalysis would you say had an impact or has views that would appeal to you?
Christ. I really don't know, because my work in catalysis has really been for quite a short period of time, and it's really addressing specific problems rather than the work in catalysis as a research area. I've never been in one area long enough to really get to know the major players in the area. To me, it's really just solving a particular problem that I happen to have at the moment. I mean, for example, our work on syngas production from natural gas by partial oxidation, we have used isotope tracer and other techniques to basically prove the mechanism of the reaction on some catalyst surfaces, and these results, which haven't been published yet, I think contradict much of what is in the literature at the moment. And that's simply driven by, I mean, our involvement in that work is simply driven by a need to obtain funding from our government so that I can continue to employ the people that I have.
How would you classify yourself as industry versus academic?
We're very much an industrial laboratory, and the work that we do has to have industrial relevance. In the example that I cited, we simply did, I guess, about 3 or 4 months study to try and come to grips with the mechanism of that reaction, simply to help us in the development of better catalysts. We felt at the time that it was important for us to understand which way the reaction was going, so that we could more sensibly use and search for better catalysts. But my work is very much on the industrial side rather than the academic end of the spectrum.
How would you contrast academic, industrial cooperation, interactions in Australia versus the U.S.?
Well, I think my appreciation of the U.S. situation is not too good. In Australia, it's lousy. Industry is very reluctant to become involved in research and development. The time frame in which they think is probably no longer than 6 months in most cases, and it is extremely difficult to get these people to become involved in longer term development work. I suspect in the United States it's probably not quite as bad as it is in Australia, although it's probably worse now than it might have been, say, 5-10 years ago. But that's just my intuition.
Who did you work with to get your PhD?
There's a man by the name of Dr. Garnett, who was a radiation chemist at University of New South Wales.
He is the one that worked with deuterium tracer studies. But what did you work on for your PhD?
I worked on radiation chemistry of methanol. It had nothing to do with deuterium exchange reactions.
What sort of person was he in directing research? Hands-on, or?
No, Jack was probably best described as a riverboat gambler. He was a real entrepreneur and perhaps a little bit of a, well, con man is not quite the right word. But he left us very much alone, and in my particular case, I enjoyed it. I was happy to work in that kind of environment.
Well, he sounds like quite a person to work for. What gave him this characteristics you described?
Do you know?
No.
Oh, at that time, I'm talking about the early 60s in Australia, academic research in Australia was very much influenced by the British image of academic purity and independence and so on, and actually going for a professor to go out and hustle money from companies was frowned upon as not being a thing to do. And that was just the way Jack Garnett was. He was always out there talking to companies, trying to get money for his research and so on. You know, in a way, he was a great guy.
And his research was whatever he could interest companies in, or was he driven in certain research areas?
He had fairly broad interests. I mean, I think his main interest was the deuterium exchange catalysis, which I guess that was the area that he made his mark in. But he had several other subsidiary interests as well, which he pursued.
What would you credit as the most interesting thing you've done so far?
Most interesting thing I've done? I think there are probably two things. One was the work that we did on separation of uranium isotopes by laser photochemistry. We got a couple of very nice publications out of that. It was interesting work. I think some of the stuff that we did on the mechanism of the Fischer-Tropsch reaction I thought was interesting. It was interesting because we managed to do something new in a research area which had been intensively researched for more than 30 years, and that's not an easy thing, I thought, to do. So we enjoyed that. And I think some of the work that we're doing at the moment on methane catalysis of methane-oxygen reactions is also quite interesting.
What attracts you to a research area?
Well, because I'm working in an industrial laboratory, the new research areas really come out of the needs of the organisation rather than my personal desires. I think what attracts me is really the challenge of doing something new and different.
Have you ever been tempted to abandon this and go to universities?
Yeah, I think I applied for a number of university jobs at various times and didn't get them. I think in retrospect I'm probably lucky that I didn't get them. Life at universities in Australia is pretty hard these days. And I guess in my organisation at the moment, I have a reasonably senior job, and quite enjoy what I'm doing.
To go back to your research professor, would he have just one or two people, or did he have a large group
No,
of?
Jack had a very large group when I was there. It was about 10 or 12 PhD students plus another 3 or 4 honours students. So it was a very large group, and at least the PhD students didn't see him very much.
Do you know how he got involved in the deuterium tracer studies?
I think he went to the University of Chicago, and I forget the name of the man there with whom he did his PhD.
Burwell?
No. He was quite a famous catalysis guy. I just can't for the life of me think of his name.
Not Selwood, Petioff, Pines, Hussey.
No. I can't think of his name. He was a guy who'd no, not Kimball. Guy did a lot of work on deuterium exchanges. I can't think of his name. Maybe it'll come to me in a minute.
So he was carrying on in Australia what he had learned in his PhD.
Jack went overseas to do his PhD in Chicago and then went straight back to Sydney.
And he's retired, or?
Jack's retired now.
Does he stay in research, or?
I haven't seen him for a long time now, I guess at least 6-7 years. I don't know what he's doing at the moment.
And when you came to the U.S., you worked with?
John Willard at the University of Wisconsin. I was a research associate there, and then the university there offered me a part-time teaching job, which I took, and I stayed there for a couple of years teaching.
Was this Willard of analytical chemistry?
No, it was John Willard. He was one of the men out of the Manhattan Project.
Was the nuclear research you did for energy, or was this?
Yeah, Australia had quite an ambitious program in the nuclear area at one stage. We were working on reprocessing of irradiated fuel elements. We did some work on plutonium chemistry. Then the emphasis switched to uranium isotope separation. There were some very major uranium ore deposits found in Australia. The country now is one of the major owners of uranium, and it was thought that we may wish to enrich uranium in Australia as part of enhancing the value of exports exercise. Now this was before 3 Mile Island, before Chernobyl, and of course the uranium market and the need for enriched uranium collapsed, and it was probably a wise thing that we didn't get anywhere.
In the 1960s, Winfield was working on thorium oxide. Did you know him? And,
yes.
How was what he did in catalysis a peripheral thing, or?
I didn't know anything about catalysis at that time.
No, but he was working on thorium oxide as a catalyst as well as characterizing.
I am not familiar with his work now.
Any other topic you'd like to cover?
No, I can't really think of anything.
And first I'd like to outline what we're going to be doing this year. Our next meeting will be in January in Charleston, West Virginia. Union Carbide is sponsoring that, and they will have John Geis from Netherlands as a speaker. February will be in Louisville. We haven't firmed up the speaker yet. March will be in Ashland with Harold Kung. April 29th will be in Cincinnati, probably at the new laboratories at Quantum Chemical. The lecture that night will probably be the CIAPETA lecture for the year, Rutger Van Santen. I originally tried to get him to speak at our spring symposium in May, but he sent me a letter saying he's going to be in Brazil that day. And he suggested April the 29th. Basically, usually the CIAPETA lecturer travels the country and lectures at all the local clubs, and since he's from the Netherlands, he wanted to do it in April. So essentially, that's how we arranged that one. Now, our spring symposium, usually we have that in April.